Welcome to the Great Books of China series. Uh, this time, in this installment, I thought I should talk a little bit more about our favorite author right now, Han Yu, who I'm still busy reading the complete works of when I'm not working and doing other stuff. And I thought I should go into a little bit more detail about just why he is considered so important and what his main contributions are to the world of Chinese letters. So this will serve as a sort of summary of my thoughts on that. And I gave you some background on the man himself last time, and you got to hear some snippets of his more worldly work, we can say. And I did that so as to provide some kind of context for the discussion to follow. But I can say right now that I actually usually detest having to start the discussion of an author with the same old. He was born then and then, his father was this and that. But even so, it's necessary most of the time to have some background in order to be intelligible. And I am afraid that I will talk a little bit more about such worldly stuff today as well. So I apologize for that in advance. But I think we're all probably a little bit more interested in the actual literary and philosophical meat and potatoes. So that is what I intend to focus on today. So, why is Han Yu considered the greatest prose writer of the Tang Dynasty? Let's try to answer that question, shall we? Well, you hear from just the question that I am the kind of person that tends to automatically think that there must be some kind of value to things that have been valued for a long time. And that's what I always do. When I learn about a certain figure and hear that he has the standing of being the greatest in some sense, I usually don't try to pick those things apart, because that's very easy to do, and that's what people brainwashed by modern education always try to do. The formula for doing that is very easy. It's basically just to apply a certain theoretical standard or concept. And worst of all is when it's ideological, like Marxist or feminist or something like that, and then compare the author and his work to this theory about what the work of literature should be, and then invariably the work will found lacking under the weight of the comparison. And instead, proper humanities, proper reading, which was what we're trying to learn here, is about trying to become the author, as it were. You try to see the world through his or her eyes. So if a writer has a huge reputation, I usually try my best to sort of appreciate the good things about him as far as I can, and at least start with the assumption that I am lacking in some sense if I don't get the point. That's an attitude that you can modify later when you get more understanding about this person. But you have to treat especially ancient authors, I think, with a certain type of respect, because there are many, many reasons for why you might not get the point. And most of them have to do with your inferior education most of the time, or if not that, just with vast distances of space and time. But if you manage to overcome those little difficulties, then you can emerge wiser from the endeavor, and then you score yourself a success in the world of literature. So that's what we're going to try to do today with Han Yu here. So Han Yu, he belongs to a very small number who are at the same time deeply traditional and deeply revolutionary. And I say deeply traditional and deeply revolutionary not as a rhetorical gesture, but in order to distinguish this kind of traditionalism and this kind of revolution from mere posturing, which is what people do when they love the idea of tradition or the idea of revolution. And everyone can do that. That's very easy to do. That's what everyone who loves going to museums and protesting in the street does. But not everybody is capable of being both of these things, or even one of these things in a profound way. And what I'm trying to get at here, what I'm trying to learn for myself and what I want to share with everyone, is this state of being radically old and radically new at the same time. And I hope that you will have some idea about what that means at the end of this video. So Han Yu, he did love the idea of tradition. There's no doubt about that. And that's something that we already saw a little bit of. And he comes back in his writings all the time to the need for a certain type of orthodoxy. spiritual and ideological. But at the same time, even though that is always his outspoken rhetorical stance, he managed through his writings to create a type of literature that basically didn't exist before him. So he was not just traditional, he was also revolutionary. And I'm going to try to take you through this step by step and show why that is. And I'll tell you from the start that the model that I'm talking about is one that I picked up from Heidegger, or modified from Heidegger a little bit. Heidegger's idea is about three types of history, or three types of historians, rather. Heidegger himself got this from Nietzsche, but he gave it a more definite philosophical sense. So the three types of historians that he talks about, he calls the antiquarian, the critical, and the monumental. And the antiquarian historian is the type of person who loves old things simply because they are old. And that's the type of person that you all know. It's the type of person that you will find in any large library, sitting in some corner and researching the details of his birthplace. The type of person who just can't get enough of hearing about how it was back then. For people like this, the point of history is merely that we may not forget. And not that we shouldn't forget with a view to some action, but just so that things that once were shouldn't sink into oblivion. And it's also quite common that people like this hate the present and want to flee into a more perfect and orderly world, which they find in history. Now, the second type of historian is the critical. And for that type of historian, the use of history is basically to paint it as a little hell. So you use history to picture all the types of evil that we must avoid. And that's the one that we see all the time today. It's very popular today, for example, to write academic papers and newspaper articles, to taking examples from history and especially denouncing the patriarchy and Western colonial heritage. And that's the opposite to the former one. The antiquarian, he loves old things merely because they are old, and the critic, he hates old things because they are old and is not interested in old things except when they are bad, and he always proceeds with the assumption that old things per definition are bad. And if you live today, you might labor under the miscomprehension that this is the only way or the only reasonable way to think about history, and it's quite difficult to see that's not the case when you live in a time such as ours. And then the third one is the monumental type of history, and this is basically the union of the other two impulses. And Heidegger's recommendation is that we should adopt this third perspective on history. So the monumental perspective on the past is produced by integrating this basically worshipful attitude of the antiquarians with a basically iconoclastic impulse of the critics. So it's a type of history that constructs a radically new future by embodying all of the past in yourself. And it's very different from the way that history usually is taught and discussed. History, as it is taught and discussed, usually rambles between the critical and the antiquarian attitudes, and it's only seldom able to embody both in this monumental unity. And if you look at the critical use of history, the second one of these perspectives, that's, as I said, the one that's the most prevalent today. Psychologically, I would say, that is actually a projection of all the bad qualities of yourself, your shadow side, onto history. So it's, this is the perspective of any young nitwit for whom history as such begins with the birth of the oldest people now alive, more or less. Or if it happens to be a nitwit with a university diploma, then history began with the French Revolution. That's also very common. And if you are such a person, a resentful person with a lot of psychological trauma, and you don't want to see the bad things about yourself in yourself, history stands for everything that you want to be liberated from. And this psychology means in practice that it results in very aggressive and destructive action towards existing institutions and contemporary phenomena. Now, the antiquarian type, on the other hand, the first one, does psychologically the reverse thing. So people like that, they project their own best qualities on history. And I know that I'm using the language of psychoanalysis here, and that psychoanalysis, at least to my knowledge, doesn't have a mechanism or a rationale for projecting one's good qualities, but at least according to my observations, that's absolutely what is taking place. So my theory about this is that what happens is that people that live in a sort of orderly and well-functioning society, I look at the society and think, wow, how great it is, how great everything works, they tend to cultivate a sense of themselves as rather disposable. Because they look at society and think that, look, society functions just as well without me, without the single individual, and I get so much from society, and I'm so grateful for society. So people like this, they never localize or locate the good qualities that make this society possible within yourself. So they never think the conscious thought that these high ideals, this nobility, the fairness, the trustworthiness of a well-functioning system actually can reside in yourself. So people like that, they project the goodness of themselves onto the history of the system that they live in. And the sad thing about that is that it absolutely takes away any motivation for participating in an active and productive way in society. So instead they just say, I will be a chronicler of the good of the past, and then you're done with it. So as you can hear, my interpretation here is that most people's attitude to history are actually conditioned by their psychological pathology. And my further point is that if you manage to withdraw your projections from history, then you're left with what Heidegger calls the monumental type of history, and that is actually the only healthy way to look at history, because you're not projecting anymore. You're not using history in order to hide from yourself, more or less. So history becomes a living part of yourself. It's not something that is out there and that you're trying to judge objectively as such. It's no longer something that it's meaningful to have mere admiration or fear for. It's simply another testimony to the nature of reality as it is perceived by you as a subject. And this attitude gives history this extraordinary tension into the past, but also into the future. So you're not idealizing the distant past, but you can see it as a variant of the present with all the furious complexity of the present. And you get to be both admiring and critical if you want to, as the situation will have it, but conditionally so. And I think it's only when you have this sufficiently realistic and depathologized view of history that you're actually able to use it to project yourself forward into the future in a constructive way. So it's a recipe for action as well, because you can see what you're supposed to be doing in this large scheme of things. Because the other two attitudes, the critical and the antiquarian, they just lead to destruction and idleness, respectively. So the only way to use history for your advantage and the advantage of others is this monumental type of history. So when I say that Han Yu was both deeply traditional and deeply revolutionary, I meant that he was this type of monumental poet. Because this model works just as well on poets and writers in general as it does on historians. Because all poets are a sort of chroniclers of the human spirit. And there are characters within the history of Western literature that manage to be like this as well, of course. Frequently it's the most important ones, so you have Dante is such an example, Milton is such an example, Heidegger and Nietzsche, who I mentioned right now, are definitely such examples as well. And I think you could, without exaggeration, say that Jesus was such a character too. Jesus is a very good archetypal example for understanding this sort of attitude. You know, he was extremely deeply grounded in the Jewish scriptures, but he used it to create something that was substantially and radically new. And yet you might say was still in some ways reflecting the spirit of that old tradition even more clearly. So a genius is a prophet of good news out of the past. That's how I would define it. And the funny thing is that these real sort of innovators, these real prophets, they are usually the ones that after a few centuries seem like the least revolutionary of all. And the reason for that is, of course, that their revolution actually has become the new paradigm. And Harold Bloom has written quite a lot of this sort of inescapability of influence. Dante is a fantastic example. There's actually very little about Dante and his Divine Comedy that is, strictly speaking, orthodox from the 14th century standpoint. I mean, this whole idea, nowadays people read the Divine Comedy and say, oh, look, he put the homosexuals in hell and stuff, like, look how like medieval and how old and far away from us he is in his attitudes. But he was revolutionary as well. I mean, this whole idea that his love for an earthly woman makes him qualified to know the essence of the Godhead, that's just heretical in normal Christian terms. And today, even the Catholic Church itself basically accepts Dante as the Catholic poet, in essence, as if he was St. Augustine in verse or something. And that's what people usually think of when they talk about Dante, because he's rarely read, as far as I know. So from the point of view of 100 years later or 1,000 years later, we see these gigantic figures and we think that they represent tradition as such. But that's because we can't see how extraordinarily original they were back then, because we're not familiar enough with their background. And that's also one of the things that literary history, and especially, of course, the study of classical languages, really help you with. So you get completely cured of this infantile attitude to the past, where everything before the 20th century is long ago, and when everyone was a farmer and drove horse carts. So the reason that I mentioned especially Dante is because Han Yu has a few more direct similarities with Dante. Dante is generally credited with having established the Florentine dialect of his day as authoritative Italian. And he did this by writing a great epic on noble themes in the vernacular language. And I've always thought that it's kind of a fascinating fact that educated Italians of today encounter no really great difficulty in reading Dante, even though he lived 700 years ago. And in Sweden, on the other hand, where I'm from, we find literature of half that age almost incomprehensible. Look at English, for that matter. Try to read Chaucer. It's no piece of cake, I can tell you, and that's 600 years. And the reason for this is that an authoritative version of the language has established itself as a role model for later generations. So in Italy, that's Dante. In English, it wasn't Chaucer, it was Shakespeare. So you can compare Shakespeare to his near contemporaries, just like Spencer, for example, and then you see the difference. In German, it was the Luther Bible. And I think that you can argue that in the case of classical Chinese, there was a bunch of people in the Tang dynasty, of whom Han Yu is the most important, who established a certain classical style that more or less became the standard of educated writing forever after that. So I want to look into a little bit what kind of language revolution it was that Han Yu spearheaded. This whole movement is now known as the classical prose movement, which means that the actual impetus for it was a return to classical forms. But as we know, a renaissance of older forms is never just a repetition. It can be very invigorating for contemporary culture, and I'm doing this whole series in that spirit, of course. I'm not trying to be merely antiquarian, I'm trying to be monumental here. So what they did in the classical prose movement in the 8th, 9th century, it was to look for classical models, but it was partly in order to get rid of a certain style of writing that they found impractical for expressing their ideas and expressing their beings, you might say. And what they mostly had in mind, what they didn't like, was something that's called parallel prose. In Chinese, it's called pianwen. And if you know any Chinese, you know that it is a language that very easily lends itself to parallel constructions. And this has been fully exploited in every period of the language's history. So we have, for example, a famous example in the beginning of the Dao De Jing. 道可道非常道, 名可名非常名. No path can be walked forever, no name can be named forever. And in every period of Chinese history, these kinds of parallel constructions are a constant feature of literary prose, and they lend an air of the declamatory to the expression, and they contribute to this feeling of formal structure, and it can be a very pleasing characteristic in many texts. And parallel constructions are also more than just decoration. So if you look at the requirement in parallel prose, formal parallel prose, as it was practiced the centuries before the Tang and during the Tang, the requirement is more or less that a sentence or a phrase of a certain number of characters, usually 4 to 7, but there are no formal requirements, is followed by another phrase with the same number of characters and, roughly speaking, the same grammatical construction. So in such a pair of sentences, you have verbs, nouns, adjectives, determinants, etc., that show up in the same place in both sentences. Or, as it might also happen, that they are used to express similar ideas. And I'll show this with another example. 极貌写物有赖于深思，穷力追心，意志于博学. A detailed description of things depends on deep thinking, and exertions for novelty have their basis in wide knowledge. The parallelism is you can hear it in English, but it's even more obvious in Chinese. And I take this as an example just to see what can be the uses of parallel prose and parallel constructions. For example, here you have this word 智, as it says here, 智于博学. This word here is used in a rather non-standard way, I think. This is a word that has many different meanings in classical Chinese. It can be both a noun and a verb. And if this phrase 智于博学 occurred by itself, it would be, for me at least, rather difficult to pinpoint its meaning. So the construction here, 智于博学, implies that it is a passive verb. And as a verb, this word has at least two main meanings in classical texts. One is to be hostage, and the other is to interrogate. And you can see that the one is derived from the other, of course. And after interrogate, it's derived further into compare, assess, make judgment on, stuff like that. But none of these really fit, I think, because be a hostage of wide knowledge and be interrogated by wide knowledge, that's weird, right? But when you compare it to the first sentence, 有赖于深思, depends on deep thinking, we sort of start understanding the shade of meaning that it's supposed to convey. I'm sorry if this gets technical for people who don't know Chinese, but I'm doing this for people who want to improve Chinese and who want to know in general about this literature. I mean, if we compare these two sentences, then we sort of start realizing that this 智 here is actually 智 in its noun meaning of material or base. Base as in the base color of a pattern. And that's what we have to do with. Because you know that classical Chinese words have this basic grammatical tension built into them, and it's quite common for nouns to be used as verbs, and that's exactly what happened here. So the meaning of material is being used as a verb, which lets us derive the meaning in my rather free translation to have their basis in broad learning. And it's exactly this parallel construction that makes this sound natural rather than forced. So parallel prose or parallel constructions in general allows a certain compactness and variety to the expression, which would be rather cumbersome if you had these sentences one by one. And another thing with parallel prose is that phrases that are connected by a parallel construction always, or at least usually, imply some kind of connection, some causality and some contrast, which doesn't really have to be expressed directly. So in the sentence just now, a good translation would probably be something like, just as a detailed description of things depends on deep thinking, exertions for novelty also have their basis in broad learning. So that's also one of the really big challenges for translators of this kind of literature, to really sort of listen for those kinds of nuances in the Chinese texts, which aren't literally there, so to speak. And as I said, we find parallel constructions everywhere in Chinese, but beginning in the Han Dynasty, that is from 200 BC until 200 AD, there was a tendency for this kind of phrasing to become more and more frequent in writing, until you had at last entire compositions that were regularly composed in this type of prose. And the example that I used above is from a real masterpiece of parallel prose, Liu Xie's 文心雕龙, which is a work of literary criticism composed in the 5th century. And there is a very common narrative when discussing this, which is that parallel prose was a sort of decadent development in Chinese letters, and that it led to a certain elevating of form above content, which was then, all set straight by writers like Han Yu. And there is something to this narrative, of course, as there is to any narrative. But I'm not really too fond of arguments like that for a lot of reasons. And one reason is that parallelism contributed a lot to the development of the so-called regular verse, for example, which was the preferred form of all the great Tang Dynasty poets, and for which parallelism is one prescribed feature. And everyone loves regular verse, but for some reason it's okay to hate on parallel prose, even though it contributed to it. And it's actually very similar. It's resulted in a lot of astonishing writing. Well, anyway, we don't have to go into the waters of parallel prose. I've already gone deep enough there. But I did that because I wanted to be sure that I didn't repeat this tired old narrative of parallel prose as something intrinsically absurd and idiotic. But the standard narrative at least sets one thing straight, and that is that Han Yu, together with his contemporary Liu Zongyuan, is the first person to write important literature in something called the New Style, or just plainly the classical style. And we know some things about Han Yu already. He was a worshipper of the ways of the past. I've already mentioned that he lived in a period of general cultural decline, you might say. So the older people around him, when he was growing up, they would have remembered the greatness of the reign of Xuanzong before the disastrous war, the civil war, the Anlushan rebellion. And Han Yu himself lived exactly at the beginning of the Tang Dynasty's long decline, where imperial unity was lost once and for all. And as I've already told you, he spent much of his life in service of various military leaders deployed to crush regional revolts, and everything in his writings just oozes this sort of general displeasure with the times that he has to live in. But the thing is, Han Yu, he wasn't just nostalgic for his grandfather's generation. He wanted to restore the empire by a true return to the ways of the ancients. That was his goal. And in Han Yu's mind, civilization is a kind of attunement with the invisible laws of the universe. So there's a much deeper meaning to the revolution that he tried to, that he actually effected in Chinese letters, that has nothing to do with form, but has everything to do with the spirit. Because he was convinced that there was a certain tradition of the ancients which had been imperfectly handed down and now was almost completely lost, but that contained all the wisdom necessary for the proper ordering of human affairs in accordance with the workings of the universe. And this proper tradition is of what we call today Confucianism. But, back then it was simply known as the way of the learned, Ru. And he asserted this Confucianism in vehement position towards the two primary religious traditions of the day. That was Buddhism and religious Taoism. And these were much stronger, especially Buddhism back then. There weren't any Confucian thinkers back then, apart from himself, but there were plenty of Buddhist ones. So, but to him, these two they had different faults, according to him. For one thing, they were primarily sort of products of the human intellect. So they had like a finished system that everything could be fit into. And they were elaborate systems of ideas that they were sort of there for their own sake, in a way. They served, in Han Yu's mind, they served primarily to distract people from an honorable and natural life. So, and both Buddhism and Taoism are quite focused on the private person. So they are to be practiced apart from society, and they're occupied with the cessation of private suffering, especially in the case of Buddhism, and in Taoism also with the search for long life and eternal life. But what Han Yu wanted to do, the tradition that he embodied and that he wished to see implemented, was not something that you practiced apart from society. It was the civilizing power per se, this sort of spontaneous order that nature itself imposes on human society, and which you can study and which you can follow in order to achieve harmony and balance. And this is something that, this is the reason I'm so attracted to Han Yu, I must say, because I think today academics have stopped trying to, they are too much into developing theoretical systems that are completely apart from normal life, and they're not in any way standards to look up to. They have no they can give you no advice on how to live your life. And this is something that I think needs to be rectified. There should be a direct and practical use for studying the greatest products of the human mind. Otherwise, they are not worth it. And this set of ideas is actually foundational for what is now called Neo-Confucianism, which was the Confucian philosophical revival of the Song dynasty. That's around 300, 400 years after Han Yu. And that was all about integrating Confucianism with Buddhism and Taoism. And Han Yu is usually acknowledged as a kind of distant precursor to those people. And that's not because he had any well-developed philosophy on his own, because he didn't really have that, but because there are spread out in his works, especially in his prose works, lots of bits and pieces that the grand masters of the Song dynasty philosophy was to use as raw material for their grand metaphysical schemes. And we can almost say that it is with Han Yu that Chinese culture really becomes conscious of Confucianism as the way of the ancient par excellence. Because, of course, there was a classical Confucianism, but that's when it was developed, and it was rediscovered by Han Yu as being a total model for life, more or less. And according to him, Han Yu, of course, literature is very much at the center of that, as it would be for every Chinese generation after him as well. And as I said, he's not exactly a philosopher, our dear friend Han Yu. And for him, but he was a great writer. And for him, the essence of the true tradition was to be found in the greatest writings of the ancients, and by always in writing to strive to emulate this way and this style. And style is really the key word, because Han Yu is the perfect master of style, many different styles. When you read him, it's quite obvious that to him, the way of the ancients is not merely a philosophy. It's not a way of thinking or rules for practical living merely. It's also, above all else, an attention to proper style, a sense of aesthetic judgment and proportion in everything, but especially in writing and in speaking. And I want us to study one piece by Han Yu here, where some of all of this is beautifully summed up, I think, and where he compares and describes the greatest writers as the most perfect music of the times, where the most perfect virtue gives expression to the deepest anguish of its time. And it's called the Preface to Meng Jiao. Meng Jiao was also one of the Tang dynasty's major poets, and he was a good friend of Han Yu, one of his closest friends. And the text is rather short, so I have translated all of it here. Every disturbed thing always sings. Soundless are grasses and trees until the wind grazes them and they sing. soundless the water, and then its waves sing in the breeze, splashes when smashed, floods when dammed, and bubbles when fired. Soundless lie metal and stone, till they are struck and they sing. It is the same with our speech, always caused by frustration. Whether as melody because of some longing, or as weeping because of some hidden thought, no sound leaves our lips except as a sign of disturbance. Music is the spilling of something long distilled in our hearts, which we choose the best voices to help us sing. Metal and stone, silk and bamboo, gourd and ceramic, letter and wood, best of singers among things. Nature repeats this in her seasons when she chooses the best singers for her song. Birds for spring, thunder for summer, cicadas of autumn and storms of winter. What great disturbance lies behind this endless heave and thrust of the seasons? The same is apparent in ourselves. Speech is the noblest of our sounds, and letters the noblest of our speech, in which the song is given to the best of our singers. In the time of Yao and Shun, these were Gao Yao and Yu, as well as Kui, who, lacking ability with words, did the same with his music. 5 masters sang the melody of the Xia, Yi Yin that of the Shang, Duke Zhou that of the Zhou, and all that we possess in the scriptures are the best of their song. The decline of the Zhou was sung by Confucius' disciples in the greatest and most resounding of songs. Not in vain is it written that heaven chose him for a warning bell. The end of the Zhou was sung with the boundless words of Zhuangzi, while the great kingdom of Chu had Qu Yuan to sing its disaster. Zhang Sun Chen, Mencius, and Xunzi sang their philosophies, while men such as Yang Zhu, Mozi, Guanzi, Yanzi, Laozi, Shen Buhai, Han Feizi, Shen Dao, Tian Pian, Zhou Yan, Shizi, Sunzi, Zhang Yi, and Su Qin sang all those arts they had learned. The rising empire of Qin was sung by Li Si, and the great singers of Han were Sima Qian, Xiang Ru, and Yang Xiong. The song remained unbroken through recent dynasties, though their singers did not equal those of old. At their best, still faint and wavering in tone, hurried and stuttering in rhythm, sentimental in word, lax and depraved in sense, disorganized and muddled in composition. Was it that heaven turned its back on the small virtue of those times? Why otherwise not make the best singers sing? After the empire passed to the Tang, Chen Ziang, Su Yuanming, Yuan Jie, Li Bai, and Du Fu have all sung it according to their abilities. Of men still living below today, only Meng Jiao Dongye can sing the same song in verse. At his best, he soars above recent dynasties and manages through effort to reach the heights of the ancients, while even his middling strains approach the songs of the Han. Together with Li Yao and Zhang Ji, that makes great singers, 3 great singers among the persons of my acquaintance. Now will heaven harmonize your voices and make them sing the glory of country and of home? Or will it ravage you with poverty and hunger, fill your bowels with desperation, and make you sing the song of your own misfortune? This your destiny is in the hands of heaven. Will you then rejoice in a high position or lament a lower one? Of his heavenly calling I preached to Dongye in these terms, in order to ease his disquiet at being employed in the south. So you see that the song here is not merely poetry in a narrow sense. All of the universe is a song. It's the song of a great living thing. The universe is a living thing, and it is the poem of itself. And he describes the universe as being forced by some inner disturbance to give expression to itself in the shape of birds and animals and forces of nature, but chiefly through man. So the human being is distinguished, you might say, as being the best singer of reality. It's the best processor of the disturbance information of the cosmos, you might say. And it's intimately linked in Han Yu to the degree of virtue. But virtue, you could say, when it comes to a writer, is his genius. So every person who speaks gives voice to a private disturbance, he says. There is no speaking, no singing without disturbance. But the greatest writers, the persons of greatest virtue, or we would say the greatest geniuses, they also give voice to the great and otherwise mute disturbances of nature. So these are the most copious souls, as it were. With them, it's not just the person who writes, but nature who writes through them. So we can read the copious sense of nature by studying their writings in a serious way. And this means that the greatest literature is always revelation. In it we see the actual way of the universe reflected. So certain people, Han Yu says, through the purity of their personal virtue, are made to become the vessels through which the creation expresses itself with the most perfect clarity. And this is the eternal way of the ancients. It's not a system of theoretical propositions. It's not something that you say is true or false. It's not an analytical instrument, but this is instead the incredibly lofty sense that style has when it comes to the highest literature. And this is one reason that Han Yu couldn't but despise systematic philosophies and religions like Buddhism, which to him seemed to sort of subordinate all of creation, all of the universe, to some private scheme of liberation from suffering. I mean, you're here to act in the world and change it as much as you can and express as much as you can of its inner anguish and its inner problem. And you can't tell what the universe is by analyzing it as something apart from yourself by constructing some theoretic system. You tell it through speaking with a voice of highest virtue, which then bears the unmistakable imprint of the universe. It's your style. And the focus here is on the written word as the most perfect expression of the workings of the universe. And that's something that, of course, every writer of books would like to believe, but it's also typical for the Chinese civilization, I would say. They have always subordinated speaking to writing. But speaking or writing, to me, that's not the essential difference. My whole project here, though, is to promote this ancient ideal of Han Yu. And I think that education must be centered on the competent understanding of difficult texts. And that is to say that it's not just knowing what they mean, to be able to recite the sort of propositions about this literature. That's a bullshit attitude to have to great literature. It's being able to competently read them for oneself. That is the only way to develop minds who are capable of really thinking and acting independently and with wisdom. And I'm going to close here soon because it's getting too long, but all of this, I would say, is the essence of the revolution in language and style that Han Yu spearheaded, why he as a traditionalist still was so revolutionary. It's not a question merely of form, as it usually portrayed in textbooks, this whole overthrowing of the parallel prose thing that I talked about. It's the awakening of a conscious attitude of striving to embody eternal values in contemporary writing, and you use the help of the greatest writers of the past as models, and you do it in an attempt to rescue society from cultural torpor. And the strength of Han Yu's vision really helped establish his view of the past and of literature as the culturally dominant one. And he is also, you might say, the first who made this grouping of certain writings into a canon. I mean, you can see this in his in this piece that I translated here, that that's sort of a canon according to Han Yu. And this later became the Confucian canon, more or less, though not all of these writers are Confucian. So you might say that even though Han Yu lived in a period of cultural decline, he helped prepare the ground for a period of cultural splendor. And that's the kind of inspiration that I wish that you would be able to take from Han Yu. And that's where I think I will have to end this episode for now, because before it gets much too long. So thank you for listening.